must burn this place to the ground.
The work is mysterious and important.
In 2022, I heard a lot of people talking about this new show called Severance. Had a pretty intriguing premise. When you go to work, your brain switches from the you are to a different person, sorta. So when you're at work, you don't know what your outside life is like, and when you're outside, you don't know what you do at work. Seemed pretty cool, but upon watching Severance for the first time, and subsequently many more times because the second season still isn't out yet, the show became more than just a workplace drama. What I thought would be a cool sci-fi concept became one of the most intriguing, mysterious, and suspenseful shows I've ever seen. From the very first episode, the very first scene even, we have a lot of questions, and as the episodes go on, we have more questions, a few answers, but by the end of the season, there are many unanswered questions. So like I said, I've seen the show a few times now, and with season 2 being hopefully right around the corner, I think it's time to look back at everything. The obvious stuff that I've seen a lot of people point out, and a few things that I haven't seen anybody point out, but I feel could be keys to solving the intricate puzzle that is Severance. This is where I'm going to put a spoiler warning, and I know people say this a lot, but if you haven't seen this show, stop watching this video and go watch it. I'm not even going to tell you to save this video for later, because if you watch the show and end up going down the rabbit hole of theories and questions that I've been on for 2 years now, hopefully you'll find your way back here. There are some shows and movies that deserve to be viewed rather than just hear some dude on YouTube talk about, and this is one of those shows. But if you have seen the show, need a refresher on it and all of its questions and mysteries, or if you're aware of all those and want to watch a new video to see if I've pointed something out that nobody else has, then this is the video for you. So grab your key cards, ask what's for dinner, and refine our way into all the questions and mysteries of Severance Season 1. First, I'm just going to go over my overall thoughts on the show. If you just want to see the theories and stuff, feel free to skip ahead to the timestamps on screen. But I have a lot of thoughts on the show, and I couldn't really fit these in with the theories. One of the shots in the show that stuck out with me early on is this long tracking shot following Mark right as he gets on the severed floor. It seems like at any second the shot's going to end, but it just keeps on going down these twisting and turning hallways until he finally reaches where MDR is. I suppose severed workers don't have too much to remember, but I'd definitely need a map if this was my commute to my desk every morning. But this isn't just some sort of gimmicky shot either. It's all about building the atmosphere of Lumon. Most shows and movies want to give the audience a vision in their head as to where everything is, especially with complex stories. I mean, look at the intro to Game of Thrones. It's literally all about trying to give its audience some sort of direction and indication for where everything is in the world. Severance does the opposite. It wants us to feel like we're lost down here. We see glimpses of places here and there, but we don't know where everything is or how far apart each location is because it's supposed to be ambiguous. Even for the characters, and when the maps are introduced to us, these maps don't really mean anything to the audience, and the characters are constantly finding new things in these hallways, which just makes you think about how big this underground section really is and how many other departments there are. This puts us right there in Helly's mindset and how she reacts to this place, because for the most part, her reactions are our reactions. Which brings me to the topic of the characters and how this show does something incredibly unique by giving us two protagonists, one for the inside and one for the outside. Helly is our protagonist when we're at work, at least for about half the season, and Mark is our protagonist on the outside. The very first scene of the series is Helly waking up on the table and learning about what this place is and who she is. Then we cut to the outside world and we follow Mark down to the severed floor, see firsthand how all this works, but then we're back with Helly. In the first couple episodes, we learn all about the severance process. We have the same questions that Helly does, and this overall lends us to seeing ourselves as Helly, because this job seems insane and we wouldn't want to work there either, the same as her. But on the outside, the only character that we spend time with outside of the final episode is Mark. We get a good sense as to why he took this job at Lumon, but with the introduction of Petey, we're again right there with Mark on the outside, learning all these new things about Lumon and wanting to uncover more of the mystery. As Mark starts doubting Lumon on the outside and we're pretty much acquainted with how everything works on the inside, Mark takes central stage on the inside as well. As both versions of him start becoming more on the same page about something wrong going on at Lumon, both versions of Mark become one single protagonist, which is kind of how I interpret the opening title sequence. At the start of the season, Innie and Outie Mark are two very different characters, but by the end, they feel more like a singular person just trying to solve two different mysteries. But Mark isn't the only one who undergoes this character development. While Helly's character doesn't undergo a whole lot of change, she becomes more accepting of her coworkers and grows to care for them, especially Mark, it's the other three refiners that undergo the big changes. Mark finds the map that Petey left behind, which sparks an interest in him, but it's not until he reads his own brother-in-law's book that he changes his ways. I love this kind of irony because Outie Mark doesn't have the greatest relationship with Rickon, and he'd honestly probably never read this book, but Innie Mark, having no reference of other material outside of what Lumon provides for him, looks at Rickon's words like he's some sort of messiah. And this comes with a lot of comedic moments because Rickon is not that great of a writer.
What separates man from machine is that machines cannot think for themselves. Also, they are made of metal.
The book also helps inspire a change in Dylan, but the main reason for his character's change is because he had a glimpse at his son when Milchek had to initiate the overtime protocol. This is a deeply troubling and sad revelation for Dylan, the fact that the overtime contingency even exists, but also knowing that you have a son and a family and have actual evidence to prove this changes Dylan, and I'm sure it would change anyone. Imagine you, yes, you watching this, however old you are or whatever, imagine if you learned that you had a whole other secret family that you were just unaware of, but you're a very important aspect of that family. You'd also want to get to know this other family, but the thing about Dylan's situation is he can't. Also, the overtime contingency honestly changes so much about this entire story, and it's not talked about enough. Obviously, the entire finale revolves around this plotline, but what if somebody who was severely devoted to Kier and to Lumon on the inside was then transported outside? What if they became a politician? What if they urged others to get severed? The implication here is insane, but I'll touch more on this in a little bit. Irving has the most interesting character arc of the season, in my opinion. We learn very early on that Lumon runs its company like a religion. There's the story of Kier and all the previous CEOs, and we learn a lot about this when they visit the Perpetuity Wing, and while Mark, Dylan, and Helly are kind of just running through the motions with all this, Irving is seen as incredibly devoted to authority from day one. He's a rule follower, he stands to greet Milchek while the others remain seated, and seems to just buy into whatever it is that Lumon is selling. Is Lumon and all of this some sort of metaphor for religion and how dangerous it can be in the wrong hands? I don't know, but that's certainly an interesting conversation. It seems like a long shot that Irving's spirit could ever be broken or twisted against Lumon, but it would take something very powerful to change him, and that's ultimately what happens when he meets Bert. Love, or at least the option to explore what love is what changed Irving. He'll never have this opportunity if he doesn't try and go after it, but within Lumon's guidelines, it's forbidden. So to see Irving change from a rule-following narc of a person to somebody who's actively taking his own life into his own hands is really powerful to see. I just felt like I had to talk about all this. But anyways, let's get into it. After watching the show 3 times fully and completely, taking notes this entire time on my last watch, there are things that stuck out to me the most, although I'm sure there are other things that I either didn't catch or just forgot to write down, so if I missed anything, feel free to let me know down in the comments. But starting off with number 1, what is MDR's job? I know this is kind of a broad question, but this is probably the biggest question that we have going into the second season. The numbers. Some of them make you happy, some of them make you scared, but...
The numbers, basically. What do they mean? I don't know anything about any numbers.
While there's some rampant theories from both the audience and the characters,
Now, Irv thinks we're cutting swear words out of movies.
because this is still a question left hanging and probably the biggest unanswered question, the answer has to be important. A lot of people think that they're perfecting the Severance chips, either their own chips or the programming of the chip itself, so that way everybody who is severed becomes more obedient, and that actually sounds like a solid theory, but is it really just that easy? I've also seen a number of other theories, how each bin is a different town that they're refining, so that way Lumon can eventually take over the world, but why would there be a certain time frame put on this? Some people think that the work isn't actually all that important, and that the constant cameras and watching eyes is the actual job. Lumon is just watching what they're doing, implanting the idea of a coup just to see what they do, and this job is just some sort of experiment. But then, what would the experiment be in place for? What is the larger plan? And that's really what this question comes down to. What is Lumon's larger plan? Second question, what's up with the goats? Now, it's worth mentioning that this scene was originally meant to be a throwaway scene to get a chuckle out of the audience, but because the internet went wild over the scene and theories went rampant from the internet sleuths, and no, I'm not making fun of those people because those are my kind of people, they wrote up some answers and explanations as to why they're here, but because of this, I almost think that people are way off track when it comes to what the goats are actually here for. Almost every theory I've seen involving the goats is absolutely insane. That they're here for some sort of religious sacrifice, which would fall in line with Lumon's almost cult-like behavior, but other than this one, it gets really off the edge. And if religious sacrifice is the most grounded theory for this, then buckle in. I've heard that the goats carry the consciousness of the prior CEOs and founders of Lumon, and that once Lumon perfects a cloning process, the consciousness will be transferred over, which would be absolutely wild, but if I were to take a guess, I'd say that the goats are just test subjects for the Severance process, and maybe they're still around because of the new improvements to the chip, possibly connected to what MDR is doing, but it's important to note that the guy who was taking care of them said that they aren't ready yet. So when will they be ready, and obviously what are they getting ready for? Number 3, and I've already kind of touched on this, but what is Lumon up to? Lumon runs a very religious style workplace, giving all these workers a story to latch onto and a purpose in their lives, and this seems to work on some people like Irving at the beginning of the season, and not so much to other people like Helly.
I love you.
This scene stuck out to me the most because of how strange it is, but also because of the stutter when Kirsch says, "I love you." Does he say this to everyone, or did he just say it to Helly because she's an Egan? I'd say that it would make the most sense for it to just be Helly, but then why don't the others remark on it? Or is the concept of love just too strange for them to grasp, so this didn't seem too out of the ordinary? There has to be some sort of grand plan that Lumon is working towards. We see bits of this in the final episode from Helly's perspective and from Devon's encounters with the politician and his wife, but is Lumon really just wanting to offer the severance procedure to everybody because it would help their lives? I don't think so. While the CEO's consciousness in the goats does seem a bit far-fetched, Lumon must be hiding something up their sleeves with this procedure and their willingness to bring it out in the world. We also hear that other companies are adopting this procedure in their own companies, and the problems that come with it.
Became pregnant at work less than a month after her company went severed.
So I guess my question is, who are these other companies, and are they subsidiaries of Lumon or just other places altogether? If they are, why did Lumon let them sever their employees in the first place? There's some deep religious undertones to the company of Lumon and everything that they stand for. But are they really devoted servants of Kier, and they want everybody in the world to be too, and that's why they want to sever as many people as possible? Or is Kier simply just a story that can keep people in line? This leads me to my next question, which is simply Miss Cobell. We see the twist early on that Miss Cobell is actually Mark's neighbor, but goes by the name Miss Selvig, but why? Why is Mark so important that she has to keep an eye on him outside of work, and why the double personality that it seems the board and Grainer have no idea about? I think it's easy to say that Harmony Cobell is a woman with her own agenda, but what is that agenda? We see that she is a truly devoted servant to Kier, perhaps more so than everybody else at Lumon, so is all this sneaking around in efforts to further Kier's message, but she's doing so in her own way? Another thing I have to bring up is the theory of her dead mother, Charlotte, whose name we see on the hospital tag in her shrine to Kier. This is where I think all of this connects to Mark. As the season goes on and the Miss Casey reveal happens, we see that Harmony is very interested to see if Mark remembers Gemma and if he thinks that he sees her everywhere. While what MDR does may or may not be some sort of experiment, what Cobell is doing between Mark and Miss Casey is almost certainly an experiment. And I think this has everything to do with Harmony looking for a way to bring her mother back and see if she can still form some sort of relationship with her. While it seems that Cobell is very devoted to Kier, perhaps she isn't and is rooting for Mark to actually recognize his wife so that way her mother will do the same. There's a lot of different ways they could take Harmony's character. As of the end of season 1, she was fired, but I think she will be reinstated for helping stop MDR's overtime contingency stunt. But there's also a lot of strange remarks she makes towards Mark, like how her husband had a dream of building another house for whatever guy she meets after his death, and how they're on a date at the funeral, and then there's times from her own point of view that she seems like she genuinely feels sorry for Mark. Could this be a trail to follow, or am I just looking too far into these things? Next up, let's talk about Miss Casey and the testing floor. We obviously don't know anything about the testing floor, other than it's where Miss Casey went off to at the end of episode 8 when she was retiring, and that Petey said he's heard of people who don't leave Lumon and are still down there. It's also what Irving's Audi was painting when we saw him in episode 9, which opens a whole other can of worms. How does Audi Irving recognize this place when even his innie is probably unaware of its existence? We also know that the elevator went further down than what the severed floor was on, so the real question is, how deep does this place go? Is the testing floor the bottom floor, or are there other floors even below that? I'm assuming this is where they keep other people who are fully severed and don't have Audis. Perhaps this is where the board is, or maybe even Milchek. The only time we see Milchek outside is when he's walking around heli for orientation, but could he be a fully severed employee down there? There's also the popular theories that Miss Casey is actually a clone of Gemma, that in her car accident she died and they took her body to see if they could successfully clone it, and it worked. But why? There's also the brain dead or coma theory, where Gemma was in a comatose-like state, so Lumon took her body and implanted the Severance chip to see if they could salvage what's left. This would explain why she acts so robotic and monotone, because her brain is only half working with the help of the Severance chip. I think regardless of what the answer is, we're going to find out what's on the testing floor one way or another. Let's talk about reintegration and this strange character Ragabi, who I feel is gonna have a very big role going forward. When we meet Ragabi, she seems to know who Mark is, his past history, that he worked at the college, and that she's the one who put the chip in his head. So if she worked at Lumon and is now basically rogue, what did she find out about Lumon that made her choose this path? Mark brings up Petey's reintegration, and she says that Petey didn't follow her instructions on the sickness, and that's why he didn't make it. But the big question is how Ragabi found Petey and why he chose to reintegrate. I'll touch more on that when I go over the characters, but I think that Ragabi is forming some sort of resistance over Lumon, and if she's the one who can reverse the severance process, then she's gotta be a huge issue for Lumon, especially with Grainer gone now. Who's gonna be the one that goes after her? I also wonder who else she's working with and what funding she has for all this. Is the college aware that she set up camp there? Is the college helping her? I'd say that we're gonna end up seeing one or more characters get reintegrated next season and find out more about why Ragabi has gone rogue from Lumon. Lastly, let's talk about the board, who communicates mostly through silence with the exception of one scene. Who is on this board? Why are they mostly silent? We can assume that James Egan is on the board, or at least a proxy is sent there for him, and it seems like even high-ranking officials like Cobell are not talking with the board, so what are they hiding? Why are they so mysterious? I remember hearing one theory that the board members are actually the goats, and I mentioned earlier the theory about how they're the collective consciousness of the previous CEOs, hoping to get a body for them to be present physically once again. It's a very Get Out theory, and it's one of the more out there ones, but who knows? At this point, I still feel like anything is on the table. A lot of the Season 2 theories stem from the Season 1 finale, which is obvious, but specifically how everything turns out after these final moments. When Mark yells out, "He's alive!" Are they gonna think he's just talking about the baby and be like, "Oh yeah, Mark, she's all good"? When Bert answers the door, is Audie Irving just gonna be like, "Whoops, sorry, I don't know how I got here. Have a nice evening"? Is Helena gonna be like, "Psych, gotcha, none of what I just said is true"? And with Dylan, I don't know, would Lumon go as far as to kill him? Or at least keep his innie hostage when he comes to work? I guess all that depends on how important the mysterious work is. There's a lot of moving parts, so let's just take it one at a time. Obviously, none of what I just said is true. These final moments are gonna have severe repercussions to them. Devin is going to tell Mark what his innie told her, and since both versions of Mark are kind of on the same page at this point, he won't be too surprised. But what's going to happen when his innie returns to work and he knows that they have his wife? We do know from at least a photo and a small teaser that Mark does return to work, but why is that? How is that? Why would Lumon even let Mark back to work unless what he's doing is extremely important? Devin also talked about leaking all this information to the press, but in the short story The Lexington Letter, we saw somebody try to leak a story to the press and it didn't really go anywhere. Is history going to repeat itself here? I feel like this is going to be Devin's storyline in the second season, along with uncovering some more real-life uses for the severance procedure, similar to how she did in the first season with the politician and his wife. Now let's go over some of the other characters. The season took its time to break each and every refiner's spirit when they're at work, so how will each of them return to work after the stunt they pulled? Will any of them actually return besides Mark? We have some additional cast members this season, and obviously these could be people on the outside, people working with Ragabi, people from another department, but maybe these are new refiners. We spent most of our time in the outside world through the point of view of Mark in Season 1, but perhaps we'll get to see what Dylan, Irving, and Helly's perspectives are like on the outside world. Now, Irving's point of view stuck out to me the most in the finale, even though his storyline was definitely the one with the least amount of stakes to it, because while he was a devoted servant to Keir on the inside, his Audi seems to be on a much different page. He's going around finding different Lumon employees, maybe trying to find people who are thinking similar to what he is. If he's doubting Lumon and what they're up to, maybe other people are thinking the same, and he's trying to find them. Does all of this have something to do with the testing floor, and perhaps he's been told about it by somebody on the outside? Perhaps he's the one responsible for bringing Audis to Ragabi to have them reintegrated. If he was the one responsible for finding Petey on the outside and he volunteered to be reintegrated, maybe Petey on the outside told Irving that he should not reintegrate because he's such a devoted servant to Keir and it would be too obvious if he changed his ways all of a sudden. There's also a possibility that Irving and Mark know each other on the outside, and this was something that I think a lot of people have missed because it was so early on in the season, but this stems from this one scene.
Hey, how's the good doctor therapy man with that weird little mustache?
It seems from the description that Devin could be talking about Irving, and this plotline isn't actually brought up again in the season, so I think that this conversation was planted here early on to make us forget about it as the season goes on. I'm guessing Audie Irving was trying to sort of groom Mark to get reintegrated, or maybe not, but I think in Season 2 we'll get to see Mark interact with Audie Irving, and we'll get to see and hear more about what Irving's plan is, but if I were to take a guess, I'd say that he's probably in on something with Ragabi. Dylan is, in a lot of ways, I feel like the person who would get punished the most from this stunt, whether that's being fired or tortured on the inside, but it's also his Audi that we know the least about. Audi Dylan has no idea what his innie did, so in a lot of ways I feel like he's also the safest in job security, just not the safest physically. Helly is the wild card of the group. If her entire time spent as a refiner was just a political move, she's accomplished her job. There's really no other reason to send her back down there to work, unless she was a great refiner and the job is that important, or unless what Helly did disrupted their plans and now they want to send her back down there for additional footage. We also know the least about Helly's Audi. Even though there was a big revelation that she's an Egan, what is Audi Helly like? Does she approve of Lumon's tactics and her role as the future of the company? From what we've seen of her Audi, it seems like she does, but maybe she was just trying to win her father's approval. Maybe all we've seen was just another act, and Innie/Audi Helly are more on the same page than we think. Personally, I think it would be really cool to see Helena's perspective on the outside and have her be a completely different character than Helly. Have the glimpses that we've seen of her be what her actual true self is like, see the disappointment and anger that follows from what her Innie said on stage, have us root against Helena but for Helly. I think that would be the most interesting thing to do with her character, but I also think that Helly could be a wild card this upcoming season. Maybe they'd remove her chip and send Helena down there to the severed floor so that way she can act in the way that would most serve the company. But if she isn't severed, can she even refine the data correctly? Does she know what she's doing by separating the numbers and what they mean? Like I said, so many moving parts, there's so many different possibilities and paths to explore, so much so that it gets confusing at times. Even just writing this, I've had to stop and kind of collect my thoughts on different things, but that's what I love about this show. Let's say they don't quit and they aren't fired. I'm sure each and every one of them will take their turns in the break room, or perhaps something more sinister, maybe a trip down to the testing floor, or maybe even another floor below that. Because of where we left off our characters at the end of season 1 and how high the stakes were, I feel like it's going to be a very tall task to just have these refiners return to work and act like everything is normal again. But who knows, if Lumon is out to prove a point, then our refiners that we know and love could eventually turn into the ones that don't leave at night.
Well, don't none of us get to leave?
No, I mean, you really don't get to leave, as in they're down there right now.
There's a lot that we don't know about the future of Severance. We don't know if any of these crazy and outlandish theories are going to come true, if any of them are even remotely close to what the writers are aiming for, or if this is going to end up being a one-season wonder. I feel like one thing is guaranteed with this show, and that's that no matter what, things are eventually gonna go large scale. With everything that was set up in the first season, all of Lumon's plans and history, the mysterious work, other companies using Severance, politics being involved, this is gonna go from a story set in a small area and an underground facility to something that spans much larger. And my only hope when I think about this story turning large scale is that it more so follows the pattern of Dark, which was a small town mystery show in the first season and eventually turned into a time-traveling apocalyptic sci-fi show, and not so much the Westworld route, which was one of those one-season wonders, and after they left the park, the show basically imploded to the point that we never even got an ending. So those are all my thoughts and theories on Severance. Let me know what I missed in the comments below, and if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like, and let me know if you want to see more Severance videos. I'd love to continue talking about the show if you guys want to keep on listening to me talk about it, so subscribe if you enjoyed. Thank you to all my channel members, and I will see you all in the next one.
Lost in the rhythm of your touch.